Shelf liners, how to do them. Hi, this is Jim from RV4x40.com. Welcome to the channel today. As we've said before, we've gotten a new RV, new to us anyway, and one of the things that we've done before in motorhomes and trailers is to improve the shelf liner situation. Of course, you can go to the grocery store and get the rubber kind, and they work fine in a lot of cases. But for our preferences, we find they aren't thick enough and they really don't stay down in place as well as we would like them to. So previously I have used automotive headliner material, which is available from several different sources, and it's basically an olefin material. And so you can get that in roll form and then cut it to fit. And you're going to want to use double-sided tape. I'll put a link to the tape that we actually used for this. I've used a couple of different kinds. I think this last one was probably the best. The challenge is getting it cut. You do need to do some measuring and figure out how you're going to make this stuff all go together. And I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail when I show you one of the actual installations. But it's important to get enough tape down. The more you put down, the harder it is to get the shelf liner in and smooth in bigger spaces or longer spaces. But the better it holds in the long run. In particular, you want to make sure you have a good bond at the front of the shelf liner where you put material in and out, because there is a tendency to slide things on the shelf liner, and with time that'll cause it to move either in or out depending on which way you're sliding it. So I end up with really a square around the bottom of whatever I'm doing, and then more places across and down the middle to form a good location for all of the tape to bond to the shelf liner. Once the shelf liner hits the tape, it can be moved, but it becomes more and more difficult because each time you pull it up, you leave some fiber in the tape, which gives you less contact area for the next time around. But it does work quite well. We're very happy with it. The shelf liner makes it more difficult for things to slide around as you drive down the road. Also gives you a fair amount of sound insulation, so that helps with the various noises and creaks. The material comes in a 6-foot wide roll, and it's as long as you would like to have it. So it's up to you to measure your area. I would suggest maybe a 15 to 20% extra allowance for cutting and fitting and those kinds of things, and a mistake which may occasionally occur and you have to start over again. But overall, I think the project came out quite well. Chris and I are both pleased with it. So I'll give you some details for how we did in one specific location. The first thing you're going to need is obviously a roll of headliner material. The sofa and the dinette make a great place to put the roll of material. The table will go right in front of this, so I can unroll it off of the roll onto the work surface for cutting as we move forward. The table is a folding table we have, which has legs which extend up to a working stand-up height, so it's very useful for doing this kind of project. And of course, you're going to need at least one pair of scissors. These are short scissors. And we have a longer pair of scissors for making the longer cuts. In addition to that, we're going to want a utility knife. We really don't cut much with the utility knife, but we do use it to score the material for where we're going to have a cut line. We'll come back and cut it with the scissors. You'll see that in a minute. And for those final cuts and in the corners where you can't get the scissors, straight edge razor blades are extremely useful for that. And so we have those available to us. You will, of course, need a tape measure to measure the dimensions for how you're going to cut the material. If it's a drawer or a small space, I typically will cut the material, dry cut it to fit it into place very easily. That is not practical in a large shelf, so I end up cutting it about an inch too long and about a half an inch too wide. And when I place it in there, I place the one end of it and the back up tight against the walls. And the other side has some overlap, which I really use the utility knife to help put it into the corners, and then the razor blade to cut it to fit when it's all taped down. Speaking of tape, you will need double-sided tape, and this is commonly called carpet tape. Once you put the headliner material in contact with it, it becomes more and more difficult to move. The longer it sits there and the more contact area it has, you can scrunch it around a little bit, but once it's in place, it's going to pretty well going to stay there. You do want to line the area with all four edges, having a good bond of tape around the entire circumference or peripheral of the cut. And then in the middle, if it's a wide shelf, you might want to put a strip down the middle, put cross strips in. So you have every so often, you'll have a lot of tape to hold the material in place. We have a small shelf here on the bottom of this cabinet under a TV set that we want to put a piece of fabric in on the bottom. And so it's not very wide. It's also not very deep. So the first thing we're going to have to do is figure out the width of the fabric. And if I measure that, it's just a shade over 6 inches, like a 6 1/8 of an inch. So that's the width we're going to need to cut. And then once we get that done, we'll fit it in. This one's a little more complicated than some because it does have square posts in both corners. One thing I did not mention earlier was you need a very good straight edge for this process. This happens to be a piece of aluminum extrusion I have left over from another project, but it's very, very good. It's square. You can pick up various aluminum extrusions at Home Depot or Lowe's, and as long as you get one that has an angle in it, it can be a right angle or a square, whatever, it needs to be rigid enough that you can use it to draw the knife against. So we have our tape measure here, and what we're going to do in this particular case, we need a 6-inch wide strip, or actually 6 1/8, just slightly wider than 6 inches. And because my table is shorter than the length of the fabric, it does take 2 cuts on this, or two passes on this to make it work. You slide the table down or slide the fabric the other way. Either one will work. But to start with, we're going to set up our straight edge. And we do this instead of marking, because marking, of course, is going to leave a mark on the fabric after you're through, and this may take a couple of times to get it because one end moves, the other end moves. I'm setting this at just about 6 1/8 of an inches wide. I want to cut this particular one as close as I can, and I will go back and forth a few times between each end of it. Now, what I'm going to do is, I cannot cut through this fabric with a utility knife, but I'm really going to use it to make a score line that I will then come back and cut with a pair of scissors. And so it's very important that once you have it in place, that you hold this. I don't want to damage the table, of course, but I will not be able to cut through, so I'm not too worried about that. And you simply take the knife and score, pressing down firmly with the left hand. In my case, I'm right-handed, and score this a few times. I'm pressing about as hard as I can. Again, I'm not worried about cutting through because the knife is really not, even though it's a utility knife, is not quite good enough to cut this fabric. So once we have that done, we can move this out of the way. And we don't need the tape measure at this point. Now, it probably doesn't show on the camera, but I can see a score line right down through here. And so all I'm going to do now is simply cut with a pair of scissors as straight as I can. And it works out because we're dealing with fabric, this will be okay. So I'm simply placing the scissors here and cutting along as far as I can go. It helps to be tall and have long arms when you're doing this on a 4-foot long table. So what I'm going to do now, because I have to go the rest of the way down, get my straight edge out of the way over here, and I'm simply going to pull the fabric this way. I need to slide the fabric far enough to keep it relatively square on the table, and where my other end is gives me a good work surface. Now that I've moved the fabric down to the table, You can't see it, but this end is lined up with the cut. Need to make sure I have my 6 1/8 of an inch back here. And I am ready to finish scoring from my last cut. You do be a little bit careful at the end not to dig into the table here, but I want to make sure I have a good mark so I can see what's going on all the way down. Close your utility knife up to keep things safe. You can move this out of the way. And now we can finish our cut from the other end. We have one piece of fabric, which is just over 6 inches wide, ready to go into the bottom of our shelves. This is the tape pattern, which is typical of what I've done under all of the places I have put this material in. And in particular, you want a solid line of tape along all of the outside edges and the ends so that the material can't get pulled up as you slide things in and out of shelves. And then in this case, it wouldn't need the centerpiece, which if I can point to it, my fingers may or may not be in focus, but right there. That is not necessary in something that's this small, but I put it in to illustrate that you do want every couple of feet or so, 2.5 feet, you want to have another piece of tape going across. If it's a really wide shelf, say more than about 12 inches wide, you may want a third strip of tape going down the middle. For places where it's too big to dry fit everything and get it in place, and you have to do it one section at a time, then you can pull the paper off of the tape one section at a time and expose it. And I usually cut those oversized by about 1/2 inch so that there's some working margin around the edges. And try and get 2 of the corners, say the back side and the right-hand side. For me, I'm right-handed. Get those snug into the corners. Keep the back side snug against the back as you go along, moving the fabric down and pulling the tape off as you go, or in sections ahead of you. And then smooth it out as you go so that the front side would have a lip curling up. And get it down to the corners as best you can and tight as best you can across the tape. And when that's all in place, then you come back, and that's where the razor blade is useful. I found a utility knife just is not good enough to cut this material all the way through. And so I use a razor blade, a single-edged razor blade, and use that to cut the excess material out, keeping it taut and keeping it in place. The tape will mostly do that, but that way you can trim it to fit after everything is in place. At this point, I have just dry fit the new piece into the shelf and trimmed it as I needed to get it to lay flat. There's the finished liner in this shelf. It's one of the smaller ones that I did. The bigger ones took a lot longer and were much more difficult to film. I thought this one might be a good small illustration of how you do it. There are some techniques to it. You just kind of learn as you go. It's not particularly hard. Well, this is the material that I use for this project. As I said, it's an olefin headliner. Sold to replace the covering over your roof that's above your head in a car or truck or whatever. And it comes in various colors. This is an off-white kind of color, an ivory color. And when you look at it, and I'm sure this won't show on the camera, but there are 2 sides to it. There's one side which is generally the downside in the headliner, the upside on your shelves that you want to have up. And it's a little fuzzier, a little furrier, if you will, the way the olefin gets put together. And again, you can't see it, but there are very definite ridges across the material in this direction. So you can use that for a cut line if you want to do that when you're cutting across the material. And the other side is much more pronounced with the indentations from how the material is formed in the first place. But it's very, very useful. It's very, very resilient. It's easy to clean, relatively easy to put in place. It's nice and stiff. It doesn't flop around too much. And you can hold it down with tape, or perhaps not hold it down at all if you don't care about it sliding around. But we found using double-sided carpet tape is the best way to put this material in. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something about it. As I said, we'll put links down below to the materials I actually used, and none of these are affiliate links for our channel, so if you're welcome to go use those or find other locations yourself wherever you want to get the material. If you find this useful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please click on the subscribe button down below. That'll give you access to our channel as we post new ones. If you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified by YouTube when we post a new video. And this is our first video of 2020, so Happy New Year to all of you, and we hope you've had a great, wonderful holiday, and we hope you're looking forward to a great new year. So join us as we travel the highways and byways of America. And remember, as you drive down the road, keep her between the ditches.